Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Here we are in the course on bioethical issues at the end of human life within the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning, as always, with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated, and you shall renew the face of the earth. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. All right, questions, comments from anything previous or ongoing? Well, I have a comment. I have two comments. I have not gotten all the hours of everyone by last night yet. So that's still pending, folks, please. All right. I am assuming that we have all completed our synaptic pruning, that we are now responsible adults moving forward in this valley of tears until the good Lord calls us to a better life. And so please, by Friday night, send me your hours, all right? All right, also there is the course evaluation, which is, I'm showing it on the screen. Can you people see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent, thank you. Joe, welcome. Let me turn off the lights in here, all right? Right, okay, so I have no idea why there's a duplicate of this course. At the same time, at the same place, etc. But you can see that, let me see, one has, yes. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger, maybe too small. Let me try this. Great. All right. So you can see this is an email that I got telling me that this course is already open for evaluation by the students. That means the 5 of you, okay? Now, a little technicality here. I have no idea why it's duplicated like this, but if we go all the way here to response rate, it's quite obvious that 0% means that none of you have evaluated yet. You're supposed to get an email also. I know, folks, email. You're bombarded by emails. I'm bombarded by emails. So we have to go through them. We have to go through them. And it's one of the pains of modern living. And the way I see it is, well, at least I don't have to go to the post office. I don't have to write a letter physically and take it to the post office with a stamp and all that. It's all email, right? So there's the advantage. Now you see this little fraction here, 0/0. And 0/5. So one is a fake course, it's fake news, and the other one is real news. The fake news is the 0/0 because that means, oh, now this other thing. Yeah, 0/0 means that there are 0 students registered on this course and 0 response, right? So the first one is fake news, this one. Just in case you get 2 options to go into the course, see it's listed the same thing. Bio 603, section 170, the same thing, which section 170 means it's a blended course, all right? But this is the real news here. 5 students registered, the 5 of you, and 0 have responded so far. So please, first, ignore the fake news. Second, click into the real news. All right, which is this course, the second one listed on my screen here, and evaluate the course. All right, please do it. Some of you are doing it, some of you are not doing it. Take the time to do it, please, because we professors are assessed on this, whether our students evaluate us or not. This may actually hinge on whether I have an opportunity to advance in rank from associate professor to full professor, which is what I plan to do in this coming academic year. So it's real, it's important, it's serious for me, and I do look at them and I try to see what the suggestions are for making the course better, all right? So please do evaluate it. It takes just a couple of minutes to do the thing. Do it, all right? Any questions or comments on that? Do you not know how to find it? Typically, it's going to be, well, you should have received an email about it, but if not, maybe it's on Canvas, maybe it's in your self-service portal of your STU account, right? Under My Bobcat, your My Bobcat. Okay, I know that page has also changed. As soon as I learn it, they change it. So I have to learn it again. This is just for laughs because, you know, I've taken the philosophy that if I don't laugh, I cry. So I have decided to laugh instead. This is the new portal for My Bobcat. Let me do this. STU in my primitive way of how to get to it. I just put STU and click into it, and then it gives me options here, My Bobcat. So let's go to My Bobcat. Yes, I have to do all this here. Coffee, and then the password, which also, one morning I tried to log in. I cannot log in because the system changed my password or disabled my password because it's already 6 months. So now every 6 months or whatever time they decide, I also have to change the password. So many crazy passwords. I put it in my phone, what is that note thing? Notes. As I'm rambling here, let me give you a view of my cell phone and this yellow thing, yellow and white notes, okay? That's an extension of my being, of my brain, because the elevator no longer reaches the penthouse. So therefore, I make folders in there, virtual folders, and in the folders, I put my laptops, my passwords. So everyone has different requirements for the passwords. I wish I could use one for them all. In fact, I wish I didn't have to use any password at all. If they want to cheat me, they can cheat me. Who cares? All right, so this is the new My Bobcat thing. And so I had just mastered the other one, and now I have to remaster this. Look at that. How about 100 tiles to learn, right? Even if you want the weather, how about the weather? Yes, the U weather. Goodness gracious, this is what we have. All right, so there it is. You learn it, I learn it, and we'll survive one way or another. Okay, where was I? So yes, course evaluation. Find it somehow, somewhere, and do it, please. Okay. And the hours, also do that, please. All right, moving forward then, but we get into the academics, into the real deal. All right, so last lecture was important because of technicalities. Now, more and more, as I reflect on not just this course, but the actual theme of bioethical issues at the end of human life, right? Well, we know that it's coming to us sooner or later. For all of us, we're going to have to face the grave. And therefore, better be prepared, like they say in the Scouts. Be prepared, because it's coming. And there is that little saying, if we fail to prepare, then we have prepared to fail automatically. All right. I'm thinking that there are really 4 pillars that are holding the program and just bioethics in general. So we need to master some degree of biology, technology, philosophy, and theology. All right, so those are really the 4 pillars, the 4 foundations for mastering, and this is literally at the master's level. So it's a little beyond just basic concepts at the bachelor level, not to mention high school. Biology, technology, philosophy, and theology. And you notice that for principal bioethics, which is what the program is based on, those are the pillars on which I work, I operate. So typically every course, the first part of it is mostly the biology and the technology, because those are the facts of life. That's how life happens. Outside this wall and within this wall, anything living, any living organism has certain restrictions or certain laws by which they abide. You can take it all the way down to the atomic theory, how atoms are the stable unit of matter, and then atoms coming together for molecules, molecules forming together form organelles. We've already made the jump into life, because then organelles coming together function within the cell, and the cell is the functional unit of life, not matter, but life. So imagine how many orders of magnitude greater we are from just the atom, the standard model of the atom, which is still holds, right? Protons at the nucleus, electrons orbiting, neutrons also at mass, which make different isotopes, etc. But we see basic unit of matter is super tiny, really the smallest we can get that is stable, which is the atom. But then the basic unit of life is many orders of magnitude greater. And those orders of magnitude is organization, is order, because atoms have to come together in an orderly fashion to form molecules. All right, and then those molecules also have to come together to form the organelles, which have, imagine a mitochondrion, imagine a chloroplast within the cell, imagine even the nucleus of the cell. All of the elegant ordering that needs to occur of that matter, of that material stuff, physical, that can be measured, right? To form the organelle that is going to function, but the organelle by itself is just like an organ of the body, right? If I just have a heart on top of the table and a liver and a kidney and a brain, that doesn't make a human being. They'll have to work together in coordination in what we call an integration of the organism. And the outermost system of that is going to be the integumentary system, which is the skin, right? And so there's an integration. Also for the cell, there's an integration of all those organelles to function properly. Millions of chemical reactions that happen in an orderly fashion, not just chaotic, as if we were burning wood and just basically producing at the matter level CO2 and water, which is also produced in burning, and also carbon ash, and then at the energy level, heat, which dissipates. No, that's disorder. Heat dissipating into the universe. What is the technical term for that? Heat dissipating into the universe. Think about it. Heat dissipating into the universe. Is it available for work? No, it's dissipating into the universe. And so dissipating means that it's getting cooler and cooler and cooler as it goes into the universe for millions and millions and millions of miles that it will continue to travel until there's practically nothing. So that is called entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, okay? And this is a universal law, not just for Earth, not just for the solar system, not just for the Milky Way galaxy, for the universe. These are universal laws that apply. So that heat is lost. All right, what's a byproduct is an energetic byproduct of that chemical reaction over which I return and return and return, which is for us metabolism in all living things in the cell, what keeps the cell alive, the metabolism. What is that one chemical reaction that is a two-way street, right? One produces chemical energy, the other one burns that chemical energy to recharge what? Recharge ATPs, that chemical reaction, cellular respiration, or photosynthesis, right? It's the same reaction, but back and forth. The beginning products of the one become the beginning elements or the beginning molecules of one become the end products of the other. And it's back and forth, and that keeps life on Earth. All right, so from the cell, cells that have similar function become cells with similar functions. Hello? What do they become? Tissues, all right? These are layers of organization, hierarchy of organization. And it's so obvious, it's in front of us, we're living it, it's part of our organic life. And so we take it for granted, but never take life for granted. Tissues with similar functions get higher, get bigger physically. Tissues with similar functions. Anybody?
Tissues with similar functions.
Yes.
Yes, higher organs.
Organs, right? Organs, come on. Heart, liver, lungs, brain, etc. Now, organs with similar function, they form
An organ system.
organ systems. And then systems with different functions, because give me a name of a system in the body, an organ system.
Respiratory,
Respiratory,
circulatory,
circulatory, reproductive, nervous system, etc., okay? They each have, do they all have a similar function or the same function? The organs, the systems of the body? They have different function. Right? But coming together, integrated into the one organism, now they form the living organism as such. And the life of the living organism is at the smallest level is a cell. But if I just have a skin cell sitting here in front of me on the desk, that skin cell is going to die within a few minutes. That skin cell needs to be integrated into tissue, into organs, into systems. And it is the organism as a whole that is functioning. That organism could be a unicellular organism, then the whole integration is just in that one cell. Or it could be a multicellular organism, right? But what I'm saying is that you see, when we look at life, it's organization. It's an amazing layers and layers and layers of organization, which is counter to entropy, is counter to the general tendency of the universe going forward to become more disordered. All right? And so that in itself, really, philosophically and theologically speaking, that's a mystery. It's a mystery that we actually have life, because the standard should be no life, just matter, atoms and so forth, and molecules, but leave it at that. Why would these atoms and molecules come together to form organic molecules, and then those organic molecules to continue to organize into eventually life? And the two main fundamental characteristics of life. All right, I'm talking again, organic life, our life and the life of all the creatures that surround us. I'm not talking about the life of the angels or the saints or the life of the Blessed Trinity. I'm talking about life, organic as we know it, that can be measured, empirical. The two main functions of life, or the two main characteristics, if we strip it down to the bare minimum: metabolism, in other words, that they're functioning, there's biochemical activity going on in a super sophisticated way. And reproduction, in other words, for that organism to make another of itself that is also functional and that is capable of making another of itself too. So there's the biological definition of life, of organic life, or a species that we saw from Meyer, all right, in the fundamental course. And I'm going to be drawing a little bit more from that course. And Job, that will be coming up for you in the fall, God willing. The fundamental principles in bioethics. All right, so just again, getting the motor started and thinking. We have these four pillars then. We have technology, we have biology, we have philosophy and theology. So they're all disciplines, they're all sciences, and they're also all arts. They're science because they do have a methodology to be done. You know, philosophy and theology is not just my opinion, your opinion, or anybody's opinion. There's a way, a rigorous, very rigorous way. In some ways, it's more rigorous to do philosophy and theology than to do biology or an experiment in the lab. Because when I'm doing an experiment in the lab, if it doesn't work, I have to go back to the experimental design and correct it. All right. And so I can tell you, being in the lab for many, many years and decades, most experiments in the lab don't work the first time. The experimental design is an approximation. It's based on previous experiments, it's based on the data and and the literature that's available, etc. But most experiments in a lab don't work the first time, or the second time, or the third time, etc. So it's trial and error. So from that perspective, philosophy and theology are more rigorous. They have a methodology, it's a discipline. And so there's a science because they have a methodology, but it's also an art because it takes human creativity, it takes insight, it takes thinking out of the box, right? To elaborate these four: biology, technology, philosophy, and theology. So they're both sciences and art, and we humans, not only do we have the capacity to do that, we're the only ones so far that have the capacity to do that. What I mean, the only ones, the only species here on Earth, of the 2 million species that we have discovered so far that are classified in the Linnaean classification of genus and species, right? And of the 10 to 20 million species estimated to live on Earth, it's estimated we've only discovered about 5 to 10% of the living organisms, the living species on Earth. Of all those species we have discovered so far, we so far are the only ones capable of doing any of this: philosophy, theology, technology, and biology. The other species that get closest to us, imagine this, the other species that is the closest to us in some little bit of technology, right, is whom? Anybody know? Come on, I've said it many times.
Repeat the question.
99% genomic compatibility or identity. 99% identical to the human genome.
You're asking about an animal? Isn't that, I'm sorry, isn't it chimps or monkeys or?
Well, it is definitely type of monkey, and it is the chimp. Pan troglodytes is their scientific name. They're from the genus Pan, P-A-N, and troglodytes. So it used to be when I was young, you called, if you wanted to make fun of a friend in school, you call them a troglodyte. Right? That was back then. That was kind of a scientific joke. Call somebody a troglodyte. You were calling them a chimp. Anyway, there's a skeleton of the thing when you walk into the building here in the School of Science, in the glass vitrine there, the glass exposure in room 102, right? So look at the skeleton there. That's the closest relative that we have. And they do have some level of technology. They will use a twig, for example, to put the twig into a termite hole, into a termite mound colony. And so what do the termites do? When you put a stick to the termite will crawl on the stick. And then they proceed to take that stick out and eat the termite live, just like that. That's pretty primitive, right? Okay, but that is technology because you're using a twig. Now, if they can also use the twig for a weapon, not the twig, but a bigger stick, a branch, they can also get a branch and hit each other with the branch. So that's a weapon. And that's as far as they get. And that's the closest thing to us. Compare that to the two rovers, the two Jeeps that we have on Mars for years now, going around transmitting imagery to the Earth. And then when it gets here as a signal, as a binary digital signal, it's colorized. It turns into a photograph, into a video of the surface of Mars, okay? Just to give an example. So this power that we have, this authority, is very humbling because it's certainly not to destroy the Earth and to do it violence, but rather for stewardship of creation, right? And so that's the awesome responsibility. Anyway, I want to talk then today about three basic principles in principle bioethics, which is the sources of morality, the principle of double effect, and then cooperation with evil. And these principles are very useful. There's another one, the principle of subsidiarity, for example, which probably I'll cover in the next last lecture. So next Saturday is our last lecture for this course. And then we'll get a little break, hooray, for about a month. And so that principle of subsidiarity can be integrated into the lecture of next Saturday, which will be on nutrition and hydration, particularly with a vegetative state. All right, person in vegetative state. All right, so before I get into these three actual principles, there's a bigger, more overarching principle that segues into what I've been talking about, this little introduction, which is the human, our unique characteristics of the big questions. So who we are, why are we here, where did we come from, where are we going, you know, the big questions. And so again, I'm tapping into our Judeo-Christian theological anthropology, right? Judeo-Christian theological anthropology. So let's start with the last of those words. Anthropology is a view, a vision of the human person, answering the question, who are we? Who or what are we? This Homo sapiens, right? Currently the only living species of the genus Homo, with the fossil record evidence there of the previous ones that we talked about. And so who are we? And associated with that, why, where did we come from? Where are we going? Why are we here? Right? Those big questions. So the anthropology is a vision of the human person, and there are different types of anthropology. For example, there's cultural anthropology, which obviously studies the culture of humans, including, and so, you know, what's a big treasure for cultural anthropologists? A huge treasure is like finding a gold mine. It's like finding a heap pile of gold. You know, it's like they just let you into Fort Knox, for example, assuming that the gold reserves of the US are still there.
When they do the uncovering of the city.
Yeah, exactly. So ruins, for example, just recently, I mean, not a week goes by, these anthropologists discovered some more ruins of the Mayas, which are far more extensive than they had thought before, kind of buried in the jungles of southern Mexico, the Yucatan area, and beyond the Yucatan, some other Oaxaca and some other states down there. They're just very lush tropical jungle that covers everything. And so you look at a hill or a mount, and it's not a real hill or mount, it's a pyramid underneath. It's just covered with large vegetation, including huge trees, which those trees, when they put the roots into that pyramid, what do? They unassemble the pyramid, they take it apart, they move out all the boulders and stones. And so it's kind of a bittersweet thing. It's a two-edged sword because that vegetation does preserve some of what is underneath, but at the same time, it also destroys it little by little. Anyway, they're doing imaging, satellite imaging, kind of infrared, or I don't know what kind of waves they use, but they're looking at these structures going through the vegetation. And sometimes now they can actually go several layers through the soil into the earth, maybe 4, 5, 10 feet in, by looking at some kind of wave spectrum that is not visible to the eye, but is visible to satellites that have these ranges. So cultural anthropology, but you know what is a huge treasure, like finding a huge pile of gold for the cultural anthropologists?
Sure.
It's, yeah, burial for sure, but they're kind of hard to come by anymore. Many have been discovered already. But something even more simple than that, that is totally waste for us, is a garbage heap. It's a garbage heap. Because in the garbage of ancient cultures, we found what they ate, what they wore, what they discarded, what they threw away, okay? And so our current garbage heaps are mostly what, do you think? What kind of material? Plastic. And then there'll be metal in there, there'll be computers, there'll be stuff, cargo, right? And that tells what the culture is about from what we discard. And so finding these garbage heaps, which many times also included organic garbage, like their defecation and so forth, and what they threw out. I've had half-eaten chicken or whatever. It's all piled outside the camp somewhere, right? Those are treasures for the cultural anthropologists, and they go through it. And there's a science that's called scitology. And scitology, SCH, I think it is, scitology, is a study of the organic waste of older cultures, including their defecation, whatever came out, the bones and remains and so forth. They study all that. So that to them is cultural anthropologists. Here, the anthropology that we're doing is kind of a little higher level. It's a theological anthropology, right? Theological meaning that we're trying to get at the biggest picture of the human person, the biggest picture. So not just, let's say, organically speaking, Homo sapiens, the organ systems that make up our body, structure and function, including the culture, which is language, the cities that we build, all the technology that we have, that's still all material. At some point, we have to make the jump from the physical to the metaphysical, right? To the metaphysical, which is going to be precisely philosophy and theology. Now, philosophy in itself is like the tool of theology, but ultimately theology, because theology brings in theos, or God, or the creator, all right? And it's a humbling thing to recognize and to acknowledge and to admit that we are creatures. But we're creatures with such an immense power that we as creatures can also create, because our technology is our creation, right? Our technology is, in a way, our creation, but it's creation with a small c. I'm talking about creation with a big C here, which is the creation of the human, which allows then all the other creations to occur. Right? And so creation with the big C comes from a creator, whom we call God, Allah, Yahweh, whatever you want to call this one individual, all right, who is utterly other. And then there are different theologies of how to look at this creator, all right, which is constantly escaping, if you will, as the sun set on the horizon. And yet we are attracted to that sunset, right? For its beauty, its intellect, its unity, its goodness, all these characteristics of ultimate wisdom. At any rate, we're tapping into a monotheistic theology, monotheistic meaning to believe in one God in contrast with other gods. I'm not going to dwell on that because I cover a little bit of it in the course on fundamental principles. But more specifically, the theological anthropology that we're doing is a Judeo-Christian theological anthropology. In other words, Judeo-Christian is that we're tapping into the Judeo-Christian tradition. That means for us, the 73 books of the Bible. In other words, 46 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, the whole Bible, cover to cover, beginning with the book of Genesis, ending with the book of Revelation, all right? And everything that's contained in there. So Judeo-Christian implies not only the belief in one God, but mysteriously that one God ultimately manifests himself to us as three divine persons, whom we call Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, okay? So three divine persons, and the second person incarnates. The second person becomes a human being like us. And so that we say that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully human, right? And so we go from mystery to mystery here, and then that mystery reveals a lot, because if Jesus was and is fully human as we are, then we can identify with that guy, with that fellow, okay? That fellow leads us to his Father, who is also our Father, and to his Holy Spirit, who is also our Holy Spirit. All right, so in the book of Genesis, personally, the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, right? In verse 26, we have this imago Dei, this insight that we are God's image. And so just a reminder, this is what we call the interlinear, and it's on the online, it's a site that I discovered a few years ago. It's called Bible Hub. Just one word, and you can check it out. It's spectacular because in Bible Hub, you can get what is called the interlinear Bible. In other words, for the Old Testament, we know it was written eventually when it was written, because before it was written, it was an oral tradition passed on from generation to generation. That's why many books of the Old Testament and in the New Testament also are either songs or poems, because they're easy to remember, or canticles, right? They're easy to memorize. There are also mnemonic devices for remembering. But eventually it was written down. And so we know from what little fragments have been found of transcriptions and transcriptions of transcriptions, we have none of the originals of the Bible itself, either Old or New Testament. We have some transcriptions later on that the Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew or Aramaic, which is a derivative of Hebrew, all right? And the New Testament in Greek, but it's also ancient Greek. It's called Koine Greek. It's not the Greek of today that the Greek people speak in Greece. And the ancient Hebrew is not the Hebrew that the Jewish people speak today in Israel either, all right? It's for us, it's equivalent in English would be like Shakespearean English. That is English, but try to read it. Good luck. You need a dictionary next to you to be able to interpret Shakespearean English. And that's only a couple hundred years ago, 200, 300, 400 years ago, right? Same with Spanish. In Spanish, we have Castilian Spanish from the golden age of Spain literature in the 15th and 16th century, right? Very difficult to read, and it is Spanish, right? Anyway, so the Old Testament in Hebrew or Aramaic, the New Testament in Koine Greek. So here it is, the Hebrew. You can see the black is in the original, in the Hebrew scripture itself. And I'm starting here on the right because it's written from right to left. Many of the ancient languages were written that way, right to left. I don't know if most of the people back then were left-handed or what. I'm left-handed, and I would love to write from right to left because then I don't have to smear over what I've written. But it goes from right to left, like the Chinese also understand it's right to left, and I think Hinduism, many of the ancient languages and alphabets and writing grammar is from right to left. So here it is, right? And that's the black text in Hebrew. Above is like the modern pronunciation of Hebrew, right? So this word here, this pictogram, that's called a pictogram in Hebrew is Wayomer, and it means and said. And then here is Elohim, God, which is one of the attributes. Elohim is like the Almighty, all right? They're attributes of God because the actual word of God, Yahweh, the Jewish people don't want to say directly the name as such, because naming a person is knowing the person, and it is a certain possession, all right? If I say the name of a person, I have a certain possession of that person. I know something about the person. And because God of the Hebrews is such an utter God outside of the human reality and so forth, therefore they cannot even say that, like the person, the proper noun of God himself, all right? And in fact, there's that dialogue between God and Abraham. Abraham says, when the Hebrews asked me who sent me to them, whom should I say you are? What is your name? He was basically asking God, what's your name? And he said, I am who am. God said, I am who am. So he answered the question, but didn't answer the question. Typical lawyer, right? Answer the question, but not answer the question. I am who am, which is the I am who am is actually written all in caps. He is the absolute all, right? But remains utterly other. Anyway, that's kind of a Hebrew conception of God. And they don't mention directly the word Yahweh as such, which is 4 letters, H, W, Y, W, Yahweh. All right. So, and said God, let us, we as Christians interpreting the Old Testament, see the Trinity here and the us, meaning that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit together as three persons were one in creation, doing creation, all right? Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, right? So, man is here, as you see, Adam, which is in the fuller text is Ha-Adam, which comes from Ha-Adama, which is soil or dirt or ground or earth. We get there, but this one here. Besal Menu. Besal Menu. Besal Menu is, in the Hebrew, is our image. Image, all right? So that image and likeness of God, right? Image and likeness of God. Still within the same verse, verse 26. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the livestock. This rule, weyirdu, all right, is not pillage and destroy and rape the earth. No, it's stewardship. It's stewardship. Take care of the earth. Take care of it. Because the earth is your homeland. And if you destroy it, you will destroy yourself in the process. Okay? So even for selfish reasons, we need to take care of the earth because the earth is feeding us, keeping us alive and grounding us, etc., etc. So anyway, back to the image. In the Latin, then we pick this up and we call it imago Dei, in the image of God, imago Dei. And that is what grounds our dignity. Our dignity. So we talk about the dignity, respect for the dignity of the human person, right? Where do we ground that? Why should we have respect for the dignity of the human person? In contrast with other animals and plants, whom we can obviously kill, at least for feeding ourselves, and even kill for doing experimentation. They have to be justified ethically and so forth. We'll see the principle of how we deal with that. But basically, what we can do to other animals and plants and the rest of the earth, some things we should not do to the human because of the intrinsic dignity and worth of every human being. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, from conception or fertilization to natural death, right? And therefore, you see how the end of human life, this whole issue of, oh yes, I forgot, I was going to review the distinction between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, but let me finish this first, because some folks may not still be too clear. Anyway, image of God. We are God's image intrinsically. It is not given to us by the government. It is not given to us by a committee or even our parents who created us. Our dignity does not come from our parents. You know, our dignity comes directly from God, and it's intrinsic to each one of us. And no one should violate that dignity. And that's what we call respect. And that's why I say many times, respect is the basis of our relationship. You want to have some fun with your family and friends? At a moment when you're with family and friends or whoever, ask, by the way, what is the basis of all relationship? The basis of all relationship. And they'll say communication, God, love, religion, on and on and on. And seldom will someone say respect. And respect is the basis of our relationship, because with a stranger who's walking down the street, before I have any communication with that stranger, I don't even know if they believe in God or not, but I gotta respect the stranger, and the stranger has to respect me. And once there is that respect, then we can establish whatever else, if we want to, but respect. And what is that respect based on? The respect is based on the intrinsic dignity of the human person, all right? Now, let's break it down. How is it that we are God's image? The how, right? We are God's image specifically in our intellect and in our will. In other words, we have these two capacities that were given to us in potentially. So again, here I'm transitioning back and forth between biology, technology, philosophy, and theology. But this part is mostly theology and philosophy, or I should say philosophy and theology. All right? How are we God's image? How do we ask these questions? We have to reflect, we have to ponder, think, look at our mirror spiritually. All right? And we find that we have intellect and will. We're capable of reasoning. We're capable of desiring or willing. Okay? But at first, when we're babies or even embryos, this is potentially, is not being actuated yet, has not been taken into action, right? Because we need the organic substratum. In other words, for the mind to think, what does the mind need? The mind doesn't think in thin air, right? Or in a vacuum. The mind thinks upon something that is organic, material, physical, that we can actually measure, that is empirical. Where does the mind reside? What organ? The brain. The brain. Without a brain, there's no mind. But the mind is psychological. The mind is a thought. You know, that thought is not on my toe or in my heart. We talk about the heart, but the heart is by analogy. The heart organically is a muscle. It's a cardiac muscle. It's a pump. The heart doesn't think. The heart doesn't feel. When we talk about the heart, have a heart, right? Well, we're appealing to the emotional, to the sentimental, to the feelings. We're appealing to the conscience. But really, the conscience is within the whole body when we have a whole body. But if I'm missing an arm, you know, it's not that I miss part of the conscience. My conscience remains integral. You can take it down to the mind and the brain, at the bare minimum. Of course, we have to keep that brain alive organically in order for it to function, right? One of you sent me already the chip that was generated. Is a hybrid between technology, a circuit, an electrical circuit, and human neurons, just growing human neurons on top of a grid, an electrical grid. And it's functional. It can play a little game called Pong. All right, this is where we're going. This is where we're going. So the intellect and the will, which reside in the mind, the brain. First, we need the brain in order to eventually develop the mind, right? But that brain needs to grow organically, and it takes an average of about 24 years. 24 years. A dozen years more than the reproductive system. The reproductive system takes about 12 years to develop, on average. And then the brain to fully develop, mature, about 24. And we talked about the insurance license, the thing, the car insurance dropping. At 25, right? They're taking the upper limit of that between 20 to 25 years of age. But anyway, at some point, most of us develop some kind of a brain, some kind of a functioning brain, and we can think. And so we have the intellect and the will. But you see, this at first is potential, right? So we have to be very careful with reductionists or utilitarian who say, well, the embryo doesn't have a full brain. Obviously not. But the embryo has the potential for a full brain, because the same embryo of a lizard does not have the potential for intellect and will, all right? Ever, even if the lizard is fully mature. And so we have to understand that potentially, for example, what is the one requirement for anyone in the United States to become the president of the United States? The one requirement. Well, actually two.
Well, born in this country is one.
Is what? One?
Born in this country is one.
Yes, exactly. So an American citizen, but not just an American citizen, but actually born here, not naturalized, because I'm an American citizen, but I was not born here. I've been naturalized, okay? So being born in the United States, including Hawaii, and we know how controversial that was with the election of President Obama. And the other one, which again is always we kind of take for granted, someone born in the United States who's 9-year-old can become a president? No, so what's the other requirement? that they are a legal adult, right? I don't even know if it's written or not, but to me, it's so obvious, they have to be a legal adult. Maybe not, I don't know, actually, that's, find out if that's actually a requirement for becoming a president, to be a legal adult, or can a 16-year-old be elected? I don't know if the National Convention of the Democrats or the Republicans put as their candidate a 16-year-old, who knows? I mean, there've been 16-year-old kings and queens in history, in human history, some good and some bad, but this teenage thing is a modern phenomenon, right? Kids grow fast earlier, much faster, because they had hardship, they had to deal with death and danger and challenges and violence early on in life, and just hardship of maintaining the family. So they grew up fast. Teenagers way back were certainly very mature. All right, so back to intellect and will. These are two great capacities. And in a sense, the will even more, because what is really ours? My clothing I bought at the store. So I didn't make the clothing. The body has been a product of everything I've eaten for 7 decades. Even the intellect, the knowledge that I have came from someone else, some books, some professor, someone else who gave me stuff, even life experience I've learned from my experiences. So even the intellect comes from outside. Thomas Aquinas, the great systematizer of the Catholic theology in the Middle Ages, would say that everything, nothing is in the conscience or the mind that has not, or the intellect that has not gone through the senses yet. And he was talking about the 5 external senses. Everything comes through the senses first. For example, to think, I need to know a language. We actually think in some language. Well, how do we get that language? Someone taught us a language, including the grammar and the syntax and everything else, right? And so, but the will is really ours, given by God and no one else. Then we develop or not develop that will. It's impossible not to develop the will, because I will to get up in the morning, I will to put on clothes, I will to come here or not, and therefore volition, the will, is really what is truly 100% ours, okay? And it's that will that directs our lives and makes us who we want to be or not, according to many factors that surround us, for sure. So we are, like Ortega and Gasset used to say, a philosopher, literary figure from that century in Latin America, I am myself and my circumstances, right? Because again, we don't live in a vacuum ever. Okay, so basically what we have here is the fundamental principle of my life and my interaction with other people and the rest of the planet and so forth is the intrinsic dignity of the human person. And part of that is to flourish, because part of my dignity is to strive for my best self, not selfishly, but in cooperation and in collaboration with others, because others, my interaction with others make me better, and my interaction with others make them better too, or not, depending how we interact, for better or for worse. And so we have to bring in the ethical, the moral argument sooner or later. You see? Again, this is foundational, because if we don't bring in the ethical, moral argument into myself and my relationships, things start collapsing. And we're going into the wrong venues. We're going into the wrong avenues, and we're going into the wrong cultures. This thing that if New York City lights go out, like for 2 or 3 nights in a row, that has happened back in history. I remember back last century, there was one of these blackouts by some kind of glitch of the grid, of the electrical grid, and the lights went out for a couple of days and nights in New York City, in Manhattan, dark. The people went crazy, haywire. There was looting, it was insane. It's like they were pure beasts, animals. Not all, a few, the minority, but the minority intimidated and terrorized the majority, the rest of the population. And back then, New York City has been depopulated. It used to have Now it has maybe 7 or 8 million people. Let's look at La Chismosa, the cheater. How many people in New York? Yeah, okay. Don't even have to click it. 8.5 million. Census from 2021. 2 years late. Anyway, 8.5. I remember a time where New York City had about 11 or 12 million people. Okay. Anyway, a few went berserk and intimidated the majority of the population, but those who went berserk were also God's image. Imagine the junk that they had received for years in their life, maybe decades, right, as food, to do that, to terrorize the rest of the population. But it did happen. It's historical. You can look it up. Anyway, so the intellect and the will are really by far our greatest tool, weapon. How we use it. Look what's happening in the world today. Ukraine invasion, etc., etc. So the ethical, moral argument has to be brought in. Not necessarily religious as such, religious, because religion is the practice of a religion is some kind of organized or semi-organized system of structure of worship and so forth. Typically, there are institutions involved, but I'm talking prior to an established religion. I'm talking about spirituality. I'm talking about connecting with God and who He wants us to be. Also, because we have a human will, and I'm very, very aware of my human will from the moment I open my eyes every day. But there's also a divine will. There's the will of God, okay? And if God is who God is, and He is pure love, then He wants always what is good for us. So the best that we can do is align our will with God's will. Okay, because He will always want what is best good for us. God cannot contradict Himself. God cannot be cruel. So He will always want what is good for us. The thing is that He gives us what we need, not what we want necessarily. Because what we want is one thing, but what we need may be something else. And He will give us what we need, not necessarily what we want. And it's a distinction. Part of that distinction is also the distinction between pleasure and happiness and so forth. So you can tie things in here, and get a bigger, fuller picture, an integrated picture of the human person. Let's go into the 3 principles. Well, stop for a moment. Questions, comments?
All good here.
All right, thanks. Let me, because I left it hanging there. I leave stuff hanging around. That's typical of one who's going senile, leave stuff hanging along the road. But I want to pick back up on one comment I made. And the reason why I started with that little review is distinction between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. It is a technical distinction, but it's a distinction that has real life implication. All right, because it's part of the agenda of the utilitarian agenda of going against God's image, which is the human person. And at least to this day, euthanasia is it legal or illegal in the United States? Illegal, non-legal. And that includes how many states of the United States? 50 plus a district, which is not a state, which is no. That's Puerto Rico is actually a protectorate, right? But they have their own president, they have their own laws and rules. They also get a lot of help from the United States, and especially they'll be protected in a military situation and stuff like that. But I'm talking about a district that is not the 50 states, it is the District of Columbia, DC, Washington, DC, right? Right, which is technically what is within the state of Virginia, is it? It's embedded in one of the states, but or maybe not. But anyway, it's the 50 states and DC, because DC is one that also already capitulated to physician-assisted suicide. So euthanasia as such is not legal in the United States to this day. It is legal in a number of countries in Europe, all right? Specifically Belgium that I know of, and perhaps also Holland, some other places, mostly in Northern Europe, but it is legal over there. So they have gone beyond. Now, physician-assisted suicide is legal in the United States. In how many states?
13.
I think you showed
I
11.
thought it was 11.
Yeah, 11.
11 of the 50. So that's 20%. That's more than 20%, 11 of the 50, right? Which would be 22 of the 100 if we double it. So it's more than 20%. And it's increasing because there are about 24 other states that are in the process, in the legislative process at the state level. That's a strategy that's very conniving, that's very tricky and very savvy from Compassion and Choices, right? Which is the main organization today promoting PAS. Now, existentially, so what is the technical difference? So that's the legal difference between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The legal difference is that one is illegal and the other one is legal. Remember, Dr. Kevorkian did go to prison for second-degree murder for exercising what? Euthanasia. So he was actually, so what's the technical and clinical distinction between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide?
The physician gives the medication to the patient and the patient self-administers.
In which one?
In physician-assisted suicide.
Exactly. So the words mean, PAS. Suicide is the noun there, right? It's the action. So it is a suicide. So the patient is self-administering. But the patient is self-administering a prescription, a drug, that is regulated and can only be dispensed by a prescription. Can only be dispensed by a prescription, right? And who prescribes?
Physician.
The physician, or also the nurse practitioner. So there are 3 professionals in the United States that can prescribe medication legally. The MD, the DO, a doctor in osteopathy, and the nurse practitioner. All right? Nurse practitioner, which is equivalent to a PhD in nursing. All right. So they prescribe. Then they walk away. The patient takes that prescription or is sent electronically to where? What is the building, the institution that dispenses?
Pharmacy.
And the pharmacy is run by the pharmacist. So the pharmacist dispenses. And then she or he walks away also. And the patient also walks away with 2 pills. One pill is a what?
One pill is a sleeping pill, right? Okay.
Sleeping pill.
Assuming high dose.
It's high dose of sleeping pill. Should go to sleep within a minute or 2.
That
The
fast?
second pill, which is taken before he or she goes to sleep, is a high dose of potassium chloride. It's an overdose of potassium chloride that will provoke a heart attack. All right. So then better take the first before the second, or you can take the second one if you want. It's up to you because, the prescriber is gone and the dispenser is gone. Now it's on the hands of the self-administer, which is the individual. So you see, that's PAS, and that's what's legal in an increasing number at the state level. So that's a strategy that is being used. In contrast to Roe v. Wade, which went all the way to the Supreme Court at the federal level. That strategy today would not work, most likely, because now you got to face the 320 million people if you're taking it up to the Supreme Court, and suicide as a whole, just straight up, unrestricted suicide. Is that legal in the United States? It's not legal. I don't have a right to kill myself just straight up. I don't have a right to jump off the building. Try to get into the rooftop of a building today. They're all locked, even beginning with 2 stories. All rooftops today in the United States by law have to be locked under lock and key because to prevent people from jumping off. So the straight up suicide is not legal, but this PAS is. All right, increasingly challenges, but that's the distinction. Whereas in euthanasia, it is the physician herself or himself or whoever is by bedside that is administering. Okay, so it's another person who is administering. And that's why PAS puts nurses in a very challenging position, because the nurse is the one who administers. If the patient who wants to kill himself or herself is in a hospital or a nursing home or a ALF, right, an assisted living facility, and is bedridden, depends on someone else bringing them that thing. If they're institutionalized, it's typically the nurse who is bedside. And so if the nurse is administering, she's collaborating, that the nurse can always say, I gave it to the patient, but the patient may or may not take the pill. However, the nurse will be dinged professionally because the nurse is supposed to stay bedside until the patient takes the medication, right? And that's why for the nurses in particular, this issue of PAS presents a professional challenge and problem. And that's why ANA, the ANA, American Nursing Association, is trying to tiptoe through it. But at the bottom line, so far today, they leave it up to the conscience, all right? And that's why conscience respect for the conscience of the professional is also being debated today, because part of Obamacare kind of forces the doctors and the healthcare professionals in general to either comply and violate their conscience, or they can respect their conscience, but they have to walk away from the profession. You see, very challenging. That's the socialized medicine model, that the state determines what's the protocol, what's going to be done, what's not going to be done. So I can tell you today, being involved in other circles, that the conscience protection for healthcare professionals in general, but specifically for doctors and nurses, is extremely important. And you mark my words, sooner or later, that's going to go to the Supreme Court at some point, because it's been challenged by more and more secular institutions. The conscience of doctors, the professional conscience, to not violate the conscience of doctors and nurses in the practice of medicine today. Okay, that's where we're at. Okay, so back to the human intellect and the human will, which are the two great qualities that we have for moving forward and for way beyond surviving, flourishing in life, flourishing to the best of our capacities and abilities and so forth, individually and collectively, all right? So we have, bottom line, the wherewithal to make it happen, to make really society flourish as a whole, all right? I'm talking about great civilizations that we can build, have been built in the past. No civilization is ever perfect. However, we can do better and much better than we're doing here in the United States and throughout the world, all right? We have the capacity, the potential. It's like the car. The car has the capacity to take me from here to there, but so far the car does not have the capacity to fly, all right? I just saw in the news a couple of days ago, Brazil company is trying to make the flying taxi, the helicopter taxi, right? But so far, it's just theoretical, it's in the design. Right now, every functional car has a capacity to take us on the ground from here to there, but not to fly yet. We have the capacity to make the best civilizations possible according to God's will. And in a very real sense, it involves the practice of these three principles that I'm finally going to get into, all right? And so the three principles are the sources of morality or ethics. It's going to be cooperation with evil, when we have to cooperate with evil, and what are the limits of that cooperation, and the principle of double effect, which is very useful precisely in healthcare and issues of the practice of medicine, right? The principle of double effect. All right, so sources of morality. how do we judge whether a moral act is ethical or not ethical? An act, a human act, all right? So there are three parts to it, a lot of threes in today's lecture. The moral object as such, the moral object, the intentions, and the circumstances, okay? If we break up every human action, we're going to find these three components. Now, I'm breaking them up for the purpose of study. I'm dissecting the moral act, the action of a human being, of any of us. But in reality, existentially, they occur simultaneously because I am the one person who is simultaneously desiring, intending to act in a way, acting that way, and I don't act that way in a vacuum floating in the air. I act in particular circumstances that surround me, all right, that are also very specific to time and place, etc. So these three things occur simultaneously. I'm dissecting them here for the purposes of study, just to look at them individually, where they reside. Are they internal or are they external? Okay, so I'm going to begin with the intention first. I'm going to leave the moral act or the moral object for last because it's a little more difficult to grasp, and I don't want to predispose you negatively toward that, but I'm leaving it for last. Okay, I'm thinking that the intention is the most obvious one, right? We all have an intention, a desire, a will to move in a particular direction. And I'm just talking not just physically, but to move with my life. I have discovered that I wanted to be a priest. I have discovered that I want to be a teacher, etc. All right. So I move in that direction. And so where does the intention reside? Internally or externally of the individual, of the human conscience?
Internally.
Internally. The intention is subjective. It resides in the subject, in the human conscience. All right. So we all have a conscience, and it is our own conscience, and therefore it is subjective. It belongs to the subject, to the human subject. So the intention is definitely wells from within, and it's oriented toward the outside, towards something happening. Short term, long term. Short term, do the homework that is due tomorrow. Short term, discern a vocation or discern a profession in life. All right, long term, right. So the intention is certainly subjective. It dwells within, and it's at the heart of the conscience, what we call the human conscience, or the human will. How about the circumstances? Are the circumstances, sorry, let me back up for a moment. The intention answers the question, why? The question, why am I doing this or that? You know, why? The intention answers the question, why? The circumstances answer all the other questions except what, because what is a question for the moral object. What is happening? All right, what? So bracket what for a moment. Why is answered by the intention. So all the other questions that are left, where, when, how, right? Where, when, how, those are the circumstances. Those are the circumstances. Under which circumstances is this happening? And so other circumstances, internal and or external.
External.
Okay, so give me an external circumstance, for example, for acting in a particular way.
Give you okay, ask the question again, phrase it again.
Give an example of an external circumstance.
And how you're gonna react to it. I don't know, seeing someone beating up someone in the street.
All right, so, okay, the action itself is happening, so you're seeing what is happening, but it's a circumstance, yes. What I was trying to get at is some circumstances are external, yes, In other words, we are here right now, let's say we are in air conditioning on the cover, so if it rains outside, it doesn't really affect us. In other words, there are circumstances of rain right now, or thundering or lightning would not affect the lecture. I may continue to lecture, and you may continue to be here if we are protected. So that's an external circumstance, would be the weather, for example. Okay, that surrounds us. But internal, there are also internal circumstances. Okay, and the internal circumstance, for example, if I had a good enough breakfast this morning to stay awake during the class, or if I went to class, like many students do without eating, and they're falling asleep halfway through the lecture. That's an internal circumstance that I have to own because I didn't feed myself properly, or maybe I didn't get a good night's sleep, etc. All right, so circumstances may be internal or external, and typically it's a combination of both. But again, they answer that question: where, when, how, or which, if you want to put in there also. But the circumstances color the moral act or the moral action itself. They give it a color. For example, if I am under duress, what is this going on? Why is this appearing? I hope it's still recording. Let me just take a look here. All right, well, the little red dot is there. So hopefully I'm still recording. Yeah. All right. Circumstances can be internal or external. One particular circumstance that is important here is the circumstance of duress. Duress. If I have a gun to my head, all right, I have a family who's a dear friend. They were from Honduras, a young couple with their little children, and they were kidnapped under gunpoint with the little kids. All right, horrible duress. What we do under those circumstances can be colored. What in principle could have been a grave evil gets tainted down. The actual morality or the ethics of it may be colored by duress. All right, so something that in principle could be a grave offense, what we would call a mortal sin, could become a venial sin or even no sin at all when we are under duress or stress. All right. Okay. So again, intention is subjective, wells from within, and it's a motion. It's an internal motion of the human will or the conscience. Circumstances may be internal or external, and typically in life, it's a combination of both. Now, the moral act itself, the moral object, this one is really what determines the morality of the action. All right, the moral object. This allows us to do what we call an objective morality or an objective ethics, because you notice that within the phrase is the moral object. So does this reside, whatever this is, does it reside within the individual, within the conscience, or is it external of the individual? If it's an object, then it's not a subject, and therefore it's external of the individual. I'm going here philosophically on you. Stay with me, okay? Because I'm appealing to reason. Stay with me on the philosophical argument. If it's an object, it's not a subject. All right? And if it's not a subject, then it's not from within, it's external. In other words, the moral object does not depend on my intentions and does not depend, strictly speaking, on the circumstances either. It is an object, it is a thing, it is a reality, an entity that exists in and of itself. And that reality has a moral, ethical quality to it. In other words, there's a goodness or a badness about it because it has a moral, ethical quality. This obviously applies only, this moral object only applies to one species on this earth. And that species is Homo sapiens. And that is why we do not jail a tiger when the tiger kills a monkey in the jungle of India. And we do not jail a lion when a lion kills a zebra in the African savannah. We don't even jail a tiger or a lion when they kill a human. We may kill them, put them to sleep. Why do we euthanize top predators when they kill a human? They don't do it again. Typically, not always, but many times, these top carnivores, which are typically lions and tigers or something similar, puma, panther, etc., near populations with near human populations, right? Because normally they have a wildlife to live. They get into human populations generally is because they have what? Some injury of their own, and they're looking for easier prey, all right? Because normally wildlife takes away from the human. Somehow they have already figured out a long time ago that we are by far the most dangerous species on Earth and the most violent species on Earth. So don't deal with the human. Run, get away as fast as you can from the human. They can kill you at a distance with a bullet. All right, so typically these lions and tigers, what happens is in their hunting down a prey, moving fast over the terrain, they'll get a spine within their paws. They're not able to get their muzzle into there and get that spine out. A thorn. Simple as that. What happens? That becomes inflamed, and now they have to limp, right? And that will make them less effective in their hunting. Because when they're after a zebra, they really have to gallop. All right? They have to go on all fours, galloping. And so they're looking for easier prey. And then we have to be very tasty. We're easy prey because especially kids, at the edge of the village and whatever, but even in the city, just again, a week goes by, a couple of days ago, some city in I think it was Berlin, was it Berlin? Some city in Germany was being terrorized by nocturnal images of what seemed to be a lioness. It turns out that the lioness, because they're only photographing the hind part of the lioness, what did it end up to be? Some city in Germany. It ended up to be a wild boar that was mingling into at night, probably looking for a garbage can. Okay. But they thought they were seeing a lioness. And I saw a black and white picture, one of these night pictures that are taken by infrared. And it looked pretty humpy on the background. It must be a huge wild boar, but they were thinking they were seeing a lioness. All right, so it can happen. Anyway, we are fairly easy prey for them also, especially those who are, unequipped and young and so forth. And then we seem to be very tasty, and they love our taste, and then they develop a taste for us. These top carnivores, and so generally they have to be euthanized. There have been a few exceptions. One exception was the tiger trainer who had these tigers and ligers, which are basically like a mix between a tiger and a lion, and they're white, black, beautiful, gorgeous animals. But this trainer got mauled by some of his tigers or ligers, and he pleaded, miraculously, they were able to save his life. He was basically threats. And they were able to save him. And he pleaded that they would not euthanize these animals. And I think they did. But those are exceptions. Generally, these top carnivores, when they hunt humans, they have to be euthanized because they develop a taste for us, and they'll keep going. And we don't jail them. We kill them, but we don't put them in prison. In other words, they did not do an immoral thing. They were just following their instincts, because to them, we're just one more species. We're prey. Okay, so only the human has the capacity to determine whether the object, the thing that I'm trying to describe, is ethical or unethical to do. So the small object answers the question, what? What is it that I'm doing? All right, but the what is not just a physiological thing, it's also an intellectual thing. It has an ethical, moral quality to it that I, as a human being, am able to distinguish and to detect, especially with a mature brain. So again, we have to see, while there's juvenile detention, there are juvenile courts, and typically a juvenile, meaning someone who is underage, which legally we define, I guess, 18 years of age, is unless a teenager is tried as a what? As an adult, a teenager will generally not be given the death penalty, for example, in a state that has the death penalty, all right? Because that's strictly an adult. In other words, the adult thing here legally implies that the person already had the synaptic pruning and had a full brain to make the decision consciously, and they still went ahead with that heinous crime, right? All right, so the moral object allows us to distinguish whether this thing that I'm going to be engaged in is ethical or unethical, all right? But it's external. It's in and of itself. It has a moral quality in and of itself. So what's a good example of a moral object? Let's say that is evil. Adultery, all right? Right. Now, that is according to an ethical code. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, adultery is always and everywhere wrong. So it's an intrinsic evil. It's an intrinsic evil. It's always and everywhere wrong, adultery. Now, many people don't follow a Judeo-Christian tradition, even though they may think they are. They're actually humanist or whatever, and they'll find some circumstances to justify it, or many circumstances to justify it. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, adultery is an intrinsic evil. One that may be a little less controversial, all right, is murder. Murder. I think more people would buy into that one. Okay, but murder is an intrinsic evil. But murder is not just killing, because I have the right to defend myself, right? I may also have the duty to defend myself or to defend others who are dependent on me. And so there is some killing of another human that is allowed under very, very strict circumstances. And what are those circumstances? To kill another human being. Yes.
If they like are not adhering to moral objectives of society.
Well, not just moral objectives, because I'm not going to take the law into my own hands either. I'm not going to become a police. I'm not a police, right? But an unjust aggressor. An unjust aggressor, someone who is coming to attack me, unjustifiably. Someone who is coming to attack me and may threaten my health or my life. I have a right to defend myself. So I may kill, and it's called self-defense, right? And it doesn't have to be self-defense. It could be family defense. It could be my dependents in my home. Someone breaks in, etc. And so you have all that complex dynamic of the Fast and Furious or whatever it is. But I have a right to defend myself and to defend those who are under my charge. So in that case, the killing of an unjust aggressor is justifiable, is not murder. Okay? A woman getting raped has a right to defend herself. The stuff that is happening, it is abhorrent. It is tearing me to pieces. This culture of rape in certain parts of the world, and this is in the news all over the world, so I'm not divulging any secrets here. There is some culture of rape in India, to the point that some of these rapists, what they did is they paraded a woman naked through the streets just to make their point that they have a right to rape women. It is insane. Where are we going? Where are we going? And so now the Prime Minister Modi is embarrassed. This is a This is an embarrassment, and they have a quarter of the world's population. All right? And this is an embarrassment for that country, for that nation, which otherwise has nuclear power and it's incredible. Many intellects, many of the scientists in the United States are Indian. Okay? Because they're great minds in other ways. But there's this culture of rape in their culture. Sick. All right, so that's where we're at. Anyway, the moral object is what? What is happening? All right? They are parading a naked woman through the streets. That's what is happening. And there's a moral quality to that, and that is an intrinsic indignity to that woman, and not only to the woman, but to the people who are watching her also. It's an offense, intrinsically. So that should never be allowed anywhere. All right? See, that's how we get at the moral object. That's how we get at the moral object. And that allows us also to do an objective morality. So I can say without question here, miles, thousands and thousands of miles away from India when that event happened, I can say that that behavior, whoever did that behavior, is wrong, intrinsically evil. I will never pass a judgment on the conscience of the individuals who did that. All right, I will never pass judgment on the conscience of the individuals because that's here. And I cannot get into the intention of another person's conscience. But the moral object, the whatness, what they have done, why they did it, I couldn't care less. That's their conscience. They will respond to the Almighty. The why. But the what is intrinsically evil and wrong, and it allows us to do an objective morality. So what do we judge at the end of the day? We judge the behavior. We don't judge the conscience of people, we judge the behavior. Okay?
So,
Yep.
I guess, I just gotta say,
Mm-hmm.
last month was Pride Month,
Yep.
right? And the Pride Month is the moral like it's morally wrong. It's like a specific attack on a person's dignity, correct?
We have to tease it out a little bit more, okay? Because it's a mixed bag, right? They mix in the wheat with the thistle. They mix in the good with the bad. What is the good in this? The dignity of every human being. So let's say the intrinsic dignity of gay and lesbian and transitioning people and questioning people, the whole alphabet, they have an intrinsic dignity of their own. I don't have a right to kill a homosexual person or to shame them or anything like that as their orientation, because the orientation is something intrinsical. The orientation that we each have, our sexual orientation, is something intrinsic. Now, if I behave on that, orientation, then there is some behavior that is intrinsically good and some behavior that is intrinsically evil. Again, sticking to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the majority of, at least it used to be, the culture of what we call the Northwestern Hemisphere, which is mostly part of the Middle East, Europe, and North America, and a lot of Latin America also by way of the evangelization that went there. But the Judeo-Christian tradition in sacred scripture, the behavior, the homosexual behavior, not the orientation, but the behavior in sacred scripture is called sodomy. And it is highly condemned. It's one of the worst sins, an offense to the Almighty, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. All right?
I would just say.
And today, just to finish the thought, today, homosexual marriage has been legalized in the United States. So the action, unless we assume that this gay couple who married are going to stay celibate for the rest of their life, it's not reasonable, it's not realistic. They're marrying for a reason, is to be intimate. But I'm not going to pass judgment on the conscience, I'm going to pass judgment on the behavior.
I would just say in response that I would compare the behavior that all these companies are currently exhibiting the same as in India, as men parading women around to rape them, because if a man is actively promoting an agenda in a company where he promotes this idea of gay marriage and showing off his counterpart, his submissive counterpart under the law, it's no different. It's very primal behavior that is.
Right. Okay, we know that the topic is complex, but we need to get into it because these principles precisely are supposed to guide us, navigate us through, right? And we do have to cut, like they say, between joint and marrow, right? I would not say that it's the same, but I would say that it is similar. It is similar. But you'll see the other principle of cooperation and limits of cooperation are going to help us also, because it's not just this one principle of sources of morality, we have to look at the others also, and they'll help us navigate through. We also have to throw in the law here. I'm talking about the civil, fiscal, positive law that has been designed by the country of this extra protection of vulnerable groups in society, all right? Because there is also a general prejudice. There is a general prejudice in society amongst against certain groups. So certain groups do need protection at some point from, it could be the handicap, it could be women. Now another group that is arising is the group of the sexual orientations that are not heterosexual, because the vast majority of the population is still heterosexual, right? So there could be a prejudice against them. And so we have to see the limits of that prejudice. There should not be a prejudice, for example, in hiring, because sexuality in principle should not be a qualifier or disqualifier for a job that doesn't involve the sexuality. In other words, if I am going to work at a factory doing something, in principle, if it doesn't matter if I'm a man or a woman, I'm working at a factory doing assembling some part, right? That company should not question my orientation. I can be homosexual, heterosexual, transsexual, bisexual, because I'm assembling a part. It's about the task that I'm doing. Now, if I'm going to practice my sexuality in the office or in the workplace, that's a different story, because now I'm taking it to a behavior. All right. And the company can certainly set rules on that. My suspicion, looking at it from the outside, not being a lawyer, my suspicion is that a number of these companies don't want to get sued, first of all. Secondly, they might want to go with the utilitarian secular culture that is prevalent in our society. And they might want to appear as what we call progressive as opposed to restrictive. So all those things are built into the complexity of what we're living right now. But then you have the case of the other lady who that she refused to do a job for somebody. There was the other one about the cake for a homosexual couple who wanted a cake for the wedding. And that cake business refused to do the cake. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court, I believe. And the cake baker won. They could not be forced, so. Also, it depends who's in the White House at the moment. It depends, because that, for better or for worse, that also colors the legality of the nation, whatever administration, if it's a Democratic administration or it's a Republican administration. Folks, these are things that are in front of us, so I'm not revealing any secrets here, but these are the realities, the complex realities of which we have to navigate, all right? So the activity itself is always and always wrong in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is what I'm espousing. But we know that we are now what is being claimed as a post-Christendom society or post-Christian. We're living in a very, very secularized environment. And there are agendas out there. We have to be aware of them. Sometimes they're very subtle. Sometimes they're very out there, very evident, like in Pride Month. It used to be a Pride Day. It used to be back again decades ago. It started with one parade, and I think it was in Boston, and it was the gay parade, and they wanted to do it on St. Patrick's Day, which is typically a Catholic holiday, a Catholic. So there was St. Patrick, a lot of Irish Catholics in Boston. I lived there for a while, and they wanted to the St. Patty's Day. Everybody dresses in green, looks like a leprechaun, and they go have a green beer or something at the pub. That was St. Patrick's Day, a part of the culture. It was cultural, it was Catholic, loosely Catholic, but it was mostly Irish. And so a gay group wanted to have their gay pride parade that day, on St. Patrick's Day. There are another 364 days in the year. They wanted that day. And I think legally in the city of Boston, they won. They're trying to do it. It's like when we don't have to go too far, in the middle of last century here in Miami in the 40s and 50s, the Knights of Columbus would have their parade on one day, which is a Catholic organization protecting families and helping the well-being of families and so forth. The Knights of Columbus, Catholic, and right behind them was the Ku Klux Klan parading with their hats and their white garments and whatever with burning crosses. Democracy is delicate. Democracy is the most delicate political system of the world. All right? Because what's the alternative? The alternative is communism, dictatorship, tyranny, or anarchy. Everybody for themselves. So the alternative to those chaotic systems is democracy, which is to afford the maximum liberties possible within civil society, including freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, etc., etc. But it's delicate, it's fragile, because any one of us can mess it up by abuse of the liberties, And so we have to navigate through these things, all right? It could be, for the sake of democracy, that we have to tolerate gay pride parades as long as they're not doing the act in public. It could be that we have to tolerate that because that's their orientation. And I'm not going to pass judgment on the orientation. You want to counter that? Well, let's organize a chastity parade. Let's organize a virtuous parade that promotes abstinence until marriage and promotes heterosexual marriage. Let's organize the community for that.
I think,
let's have our parade.
Father, I think I saw in Italy, I think the Prime Minister during Pride Month did the family parade.
Yes, why not? That's the counter, but that's civil, you see? That's yes, that's Miss Meloni over there. She's traditional. She's Catholic. She's a practicing Catholic, and she's taking Italy by storm. She's the Prime Minister of Italy right now, and everybody loves her. They probably love her also because she's a pretty woman. That's Italy, but she's great. She's very focused. She's family, and she's living the values.
And I think
she's
Hungary,
getting good. Yeah.
Is it Hungary? I think that has very pro-family laws and pro-staying married and pro-staying children. And I believe that they give like tax incentives.
Fantastic. There you go. You
stay
see,
together.
within the law, to promote that, because we need guidance. There are certain characteristics about the human person that, again, we take for granted, but we're very aggressive. We're very curious. We're very vulnerable. We're very gullible. We'll take anything that they tell us. Anything that media pumps out, we believe it. We never question the sources. It's unbelievable how naive, I'm not talking about innocence, how naive we humans are. They tell us, oh, look at the beautiful orange sky. Really? Oh, yeah. Look at the beautiful orange sky. It's amazing how gullible we are. Respect for the dignity and sanctity of every human being. But don't impose your morality on me. In other words, if you want to have your sex, please go indoors. Okay? And by the way, you shouldn't, because it's not pleasing in the eyes of God. And God has given us his word to illuminate us, to enlighten us, and to guide us with the truth. And it's no wonder that Jesus says, I am. And then he took it further, the way, the truth, and the life. The truth. So he took from his Father, I am, and then further expanded on the name of God, the way, the truth, and the life. And what better can we get, right? From the Almighty himself. So the moral object, again, keep in mind that the moral object, it's tricky, but it answers the question, what? What is happening? So we cannot get cynical about the moral object. And I'll give you an example. So again, murder. There's an unjust aggressor who is coming at me, all right? And, or no, let's flip it around. I am the aggressor. I am the aggressor, all right? So I have a knife in my hand and I'm going to murder someone. But as I'm putting the knife into the other person's belly or whatever, you know, in the middle of the night, assaulting someone in the streets, and I say, oh, no, I am not murdering. I am just, it is my hand that is inserting a sharp metal object into the abdominal region of this other person who is standing in front of me. Well, okay, that whole thing is called murder, right? And so we cannot be cynical about the moral object. We have to call it what it is. And so what's a good guideline for the moral object? The Ten Commandments is a good start. The Ten Commandments, it's a good start, okay? And we understand murder, we understand stealing, we all have a right to our property, and if it's taken unjustly, right, it's stealing. And we may agree in principle that lying, but lying is also as evil as adultery or murder. And people lie all the time. Why? Because we start by lying to ourselves. And then we lie to others. And then we don't even know who we told the lie to. Okay? But lying is one of the 10. And it's a big one. Now, said that, it also means that people don't have a right to know everything about us. And sometimes people are indiscreet or naive and they ask us questions that they don't have a right to know the answer. So we also have a right to privacy, okay, within context. And so we have to ask the Holy Spirit at that moment to inspire us all not to lie, but not to tell the full truth either, in the sense that if there are some things that are private, right, like our sins, for example, people don't have a right to know that. But we have to say, I'm sorry, no, or whatever, but don't expand, but don't lie. Don't lie, okay? Because that's a bad one. That's a moral object. What am I doing? I am lying. That's always and everywhere wrong. Reflect. Food for thought. All right, so the moral object, as you can see, or the sources of morality are these three. Like I say, I have dissected them for the purpose of study, but really they occur together, all right, simultaneously as I act throughout the day, throughout the year, throughout my lifetime. And this one, the moral object itself, allows us to do what we call an objective morality, where we can pass judgment on certain behavior that is always and everywhere wrong without passing judgment on the conscience of the person, okay? In fact, this moral object is based on natural law, and that's why civil law, which is also known as positive law, a good civil law is the one that is according to natural law, because natural law is according to divine law, and there's a sequence there. The ideal, so the ideal is when that sequence is respected and honored, we go from divine law, which is God's will, to moral law. In other words, I find myself alive. That's a natural law. I am alive, okay? And therefore, I have a right to be alive. The civil law, a good civil law, should protect my natural law, my natural right to be alive, okay? So good, positive civil laws are the ones that are according to natural law. And in fact, the founders of this country, if we go back 200, 250 years ago, the founders of this country precisely new concept, creative idea of democracy was found that all of the founders of this country and the founders of this country were natural law philosophers. They abided by natural law. Today, natural law is being questioned because they say, well, that's your natural law, but I have my natural law, as in the case of sexuality, thinking that by changing the appearance, even surgically, of my body, I can change my gender. And I cannot, because sex and gender go together. There are two aspects of the same reality. Sex is the physical, physiological aspect of my body, and gender is the psychological aspect of my body. And they should coincide, right? If I am a man, I should act and feel and live as a man, etc. And so sex and gender, really, the first dishonesty, talk about lying, the first dishonesty is to separate sex from gender. See? Already we've made a mistake. Right there. It's dishonest. Many people don't know that, they don't think about it, they don't care, or they say, well, that's your opinion, or they just haven't thought about it. But sex and gender, the first dishonesty is to separate. It's like trying to have a mind, to have a thought without a brain. Can't happen. Can't happen. All right, I see it's 11:25, so about we break, and then we'll go through the two principles before it gets later, right? So I need some time to get into each one. If I get into one here, it's going to go into about 12 more or less. So how about we take, well, first of all, if there are any questions or comments to be made, otherwise we can break a little bit, 10 minutes, and then come back to the other two principles, principle of cooperation and the principle of double effect. All right. Okay, so 11:25, 26, let's come back at 11:35, all right? 11:35, we're back here, let me pause. And please, 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 I beg of you, remind me to unpause and continue recording. Thank you. Okay, that's all right. I reminded my students to remind me to record. So hopefully we're back on. It's a little red dot. And we're going forward. All right, so now we have two other principles. Before doing that, any other questions, comments? We have to negotiate here between joint and marrow, navigate between joint and marrow, all right? So let's keep doing that. And these other principles also allow us to make these distinctions. Also because today, precisely upholding the values of democracy and the benefits of democracy, right? Which is, as I say, fragile, because it gives, not everyone's going to think like we think or have the same values, but as long as we live civilly and we don't get at each other's throat, then we have to allow for people who don't think like we do. In fact, goes back to Aristotle. It's really amazing how a lot of our culture really comes from what we call the Western culture from classical Greece, 4 or 5 centuries before the time of Christ. So much was developed there precisely in Athens, specifically one city, because they had peace. And because they had peace, they were able to develop thought and culture, and many other things came out of that. For example, from thinking and reason and philosophy came mathematics, and from mathematics came physics, and from physics came astronomy, and also from mathematics came the arts, especially painting and sculpture, because it was a lot of balance and harmony and so forth. Then also music and theater came from there, etc. So many, the humanities, expansion of the mind, all right? Flourishing, precisely. Well, one of the definitions by Aristotle of the human was homo politicus. Homo politicus means the political man. Is a literal translation, what we call it transliteration. The the political man, homo politicus. But broader, it means the human, right? Man and woman, the human who is able to live politically, in other words, in society, in the polis, because polis, P-O-L-I-S, is the city. In Greek and Latin, polis is the city, right? And that's the police, the polis, the city. So city, homo politicus is the animal that is capable of living civilized with each other. And that's what he was experiencing around, in Athens at the time. So we are capable of living with each other when we treat ourselves correctly and with those whole issue of respect, but it does take restraint on everybody's part. All right, let's look at this other principle of cooperation. Yes, because things are becoming more complex in our world today. A big part of it is because of technology, but also the economy and so forth. So this principle of cooperation is when we have to cooperate with evil in order for us to be able to live and coexist in a democratic society. Again, not everyone is going to think like we do or have the same values, but as long as we're able to get along with each other, live civilly, we can move forward. And so in cooperation with evil, particularly, we make a big distinction between formal or material cooperation. And then within material cooperation, we make further distinctions if it's immediate or mediate. And then furthermore, breaking down if it's mediate, whether it's proximate or remote. These last four categories a little more fuzzy at first, especially for people who don't have a formal training in philosophy, but we'll walk through them little by little. This one here is a little easier to do, the distinction between formal and material cooperation, because essentially it engages the will. And that's why I did the sources of morality first, because now we're going to tap into what we have already learned and discussed with regards to the moral act and the three components, the three sources of the moral act, okay? So, cooperation with evil. First, formal cooperation. Formal cooperation, again, let me back up for a moment, because cooperation means that I'm not the principal agent. I'm not the one who is, say, in charge of the act itself, but I'm a cooperator, I'm a collaborator. So I'm not the principal agent, but I'm associated to the agent somehow, maybe by the action itself. Maybe I work in the same company or whatever, but I'm not the principal agent here, but I am a cooperator, right? So formal cooperation with evil is never allowed under any circumstances. And what makes it formal is that I will the same evil as the principal agent. See? I will the same evil as the principal agent. I'm going to put it in the context of PAS. If I am the nurse who is bedside to the patient who has requested PAS, and I engage my will, and I want, and I will the same thing that my patient wills. In other words, I will that my patient commit suicide. That is formal cooperation, because I desire the same thing, the same evil that the patient desires, right? Again, not passing judgment on the conscience of my patient, but believe and understand that suicide is also an action, all right? And so I'm passing judgment on the behavior, which is the suicide. I may have suicide ideation, but not carried it out. Well, that's still at the level of intention. But the actual act of suicide, that's a moral object. That's a behavior, okay? And so because that is an intrinsic evil, then I, as a nurse, to this patient who is requesting PAS, if I engage my will with the patient and I will the same thing, and I will that my patient commit suicide, that's formal cooperation because it's at the level of the will, see? And then, of course, I would try to procure the medication, whatever the patient wants, the lethal dosage. Formal cooperation with evil is never allowed in the Judeo-Christian tradition in principle bioethics because it engages the will in an intrinsically evil act. All right, and that is never allowed. So not only is the principal agent wrong objectively, but also the cooperator. When we engage the will, and that's formal, that's why it means formal. However, material cooperation does not involve my will, but I am materially part of the act. And I can tell you that we are in material cooperation many times without even knowing or reflecting about it, but we are in material cooperation with evil without really knowing it. So our will is not necessarily engaged, all right? Material cooperation may be allowed for serious reasons. Material cooperation with evil. Now, I give this example. I go to a supermarket, I buy produce. I don't know if the worker who picked that produce, who picked the apple, or who picked or collected the cabbage, was paid a fair wage or not. I don't know. All right, maybe they were migrant workers, maybe they were exploited, like is happening right now in our state and in many parts of the US and the world. They're exploited because they don't have papers, and so they're given peanuts, or they're given just a place to live, which is horrible. There's abuse that's going on. That abuse to the dignity of those workers is an intrinsic evil, whether they're here legally or not. They're being taken advantage of, they've been exploited because they're illegal, right? Or it's not that they're illegal, they don't have papers, they don't have a legal status. Now, I'm still gonna buy the produce. I don't really know, if the company who is selling the produce is paying a fair wage or not. And I still buy the produce because I need the produce to feed myself. But I do not desire the worker to be exploited. And in fact, if I find out that the worker is being exploited, I should try to do something about it. I should demonstrate or write a letter, for example, to the company, or gather friends and say, don't buy this product because it's definitely coming from exploitation. There's child labor in other parts of the world. It's getting very complicated because typically a machine or something is made by many parts, and those parts are made in different parts of the world. And you know how do we get so granular and so capillary? Well, the first thing we can do at least is not will the evil that may be happening, all right? That's the first thing. So we're not engaged formally. Materially, like I say, we may be engaged materially, but not desire the evil that may be done. This was very important with the vaccines, with the COVID vaccines. Okay, because you may know, we all lived this, that of this three first, so it was Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. The first three that were available, all right, there was a question if, at least in the trials, in the original trials, human embryos were used to develop the vaccines. Since I opened that kind of worms, might as well follow through and start picking out the worms. All right, so what do we have? Three companies. First of all, they're using a technique that is novel for the time, which is mRNA, messenger RNA. You know from the little genetics that have been giving you that the messenger RNA takes the message of from the nucleus of the DNA to the ribosome where the proteins are made. All right, and it's the proteins that do the work in the cell, which basically, in this case, we're talking about the antibodies, the actual antibodies to develop to the COVID virus. So this is a novel process, had not been used before. It saved a lot of time. It put the production of the production of vaccines from years to months, which is amazing. All right. But we were under a pandemic, a world epidemic, and people were dying left and right and so forth. So there was that urgency to develop this vaccine. A cell line that is used in the labs a lot is this, what is the name of the cell line? It's not HeLa. HeLa is a different one, but there's the name of the cell line. Anyway, this cell line, which is a human tissue, which has been immortalized, it actually is more similar to cancer cells than they are to normal tissue because they are immortalized. They reproduce, they're human cells. They reproduce in the Petri dishes indefinitely. At what temperature? In incubators? Yeah, Fahrenheit or 37 centigrade, right? 37 Celsius incubators. So yeah, kidney, not kidney, not this embryonic kidney. So they're called HEK line, yes, HEK. HEK stands for human embryonic kidney cell line. This is a human cell line. There's another one that's called HeLa. But that one, HeLa, comes from a different, this has also ethical implications. If I have time, I'll talk about HeLa in a minute. Okay, so HEK is a acronym, and it's human embryonic kidney. That's what it stands for. So just like the word says, it comes from a human embryo. Now, how do you get human embryos? There are two possibilities, right? Either it is one way or another, it's going to be an abortion. It's either going to be a spontaneous abortion or a procured abortion. Okay. Now, which one is ethically tainted? Again, from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Which one is ethically tainted or ethically bad? A spontaneous or procured? Obviously, the procured abortion. If the cell line was developed from a kidney of an embryo who was aborted spontaneously, what we otherwise call a natural loss or a miscarriage. In principle, there was no evil there unless, like I say, the woman, the pregnant mom, was totally irresponsible about her pregnancy. You know, she went horseback riding, galloping for 3 hours on her 8th month of pregnancy or something like that. That could trigger an abortion, all right? But if she was basically responsible about her pregnancy and she lost the pregnancy, what are you going to do? There's no ethical implications there, okay? So it could have been that. However, most likely it did not come from a spontaneous abortion. So there's no actual documentation about this. The closest I can get is that this line was developed in Scandinavia in the 70s, in the 1970s. So we're talking about half a century ago in Scandinavia from some human embryo, the kidney of a human embryo. And it's to this day, it's not really known if it was a spontaneous or procured abortion. We can safely assume that it was a procured abortion. Again, we have to think clinically, because in a spontaneous abortion, it's typically because there's something wrong with the fetus or the embryo. There's some kind of anomaly, could be a genetic anomaly, and therefore those cells and those tissues and organs don't really qualify for immortalizing the cell because they could carry on that genetic defect, you see, and immortalize the genetic defect. And so it doesn't make sense to use that in clinical trials. All right. And so we could possibly assume that it was a procured abortion, but the people who developed the cell line was a lab, was a biology lab, which is already one step removed from the abortion itself. They were procuring just a human kidney, which was supplied to them maybe from an abortion clinic. I remember one time when I was at Purdue doing my doctorate in genetics, I ran across an article that was using human embryonic tissue, not this heckline, but actual human embryonic tissue for some kind of an experiment. It was in the references. And so I followed it up and looked and followed through to see where that human embryonic tissue was coming from. So I sent some emails to the authors of the article and so forth, and they responded, and they told me they got it from, there is a tissue repository, human tissue repository at the University of Washington in Seattle, right? So Washington, Seattle, they have a medical school, huge, very prestigious, etc., but also very secular. It's a state university. Washington State is one of the PAS states, etc. And at the University of Washington, one of the big departments there, they have essentially a human tissue bank. They store human tissues and they farm them out to, if you have a lab and you're doing some research that involves human tissue, you can request some human tissue from there. And they'll send it, they'll do some kind of protocol. And so it's a repository, it's a bank of human tissue. So I called the lab, I called the repository there at University of Washington, I called them up on the phone. I spoke with one of the techs and I just asked them, could you please tell me, so I'm doing research over here at Purdue and I read this article, I wanted to know the source. I kind of frame it like from a biological perspective, right? From a scientific perspective. I just want to know the source of that human tissue, that human embryonic tissue, where it comes from. And the tech, just being innocent or naive, just told me, oh yeah, periodically someone here from the lab, from our center, they go around to the abortion clinics in Seattle, and that's where they collect the tissue. So right away, right there, it's telling me that it's from procured abortions. Okay, they just go around regularly and collect the tissue from these clinics. So there it is. Now, the researchers who were doing the research with that tissue, they're already one step removed from the abortion itself. In fact, the bank, the tissue bank at University of Washington, is already removed from the abortion clinic itself. But there we could possibly make a case that they're certainly materially cooperating, but they could also be formally cooperating by providing an outlet to the tissue, an outlet that has the perception that it will save lives. Because now, you know, the abortionist can say to the pregnant mom, don't worry about the abortion because your human embryo will, or the tissue of your fetus, you know, will save many lives because it will go into medical research. Right? It's like they tell the in vitro couples, your donated embryo will save many lives because we will discover the cure for cancer with this embryo of yours, right? That's the lie, that's the spin, that's the evil one working in the lie, all right? The most dangerous lie is the one that is closest to the truth. It could very well be that that tissue discovers a cure for cancer, but it's tissue that is tainted, was obtained unethically by killing an innocent human being. All right, so that was the heckline, human embryonic kidney from the 70s in Scandinavia, most likely from a procured abortion. But the lab who developed the line may or may not have willed the abortion. We don't know. But they did develop the line. So let's say that they would still be formally cooperating. This line, this heck line, has been pumped out because I ran across it all the time when I was doing my research over there, and it's a very stable line. It happens to be very stable. They do passage. Passage means that when the Petri dish reaches confluence, in other words, when that cell line, a single layer of cells, grows to the edge or close to the edge of the Petri dish, they have to pass on some of those cells to a brand new Petri dish, so that the cells will continue to grow. And you immortalize, imagine for 50 years, this cell line has been passaged in many labs throughout the world, an increasing number of labs, and then you can freeze them and thaw them and use them, and it's amazing. That's why I say they're closer to cancer cells now than they are to normal human tissue, because they just keep growing and growing and growing, and they're very stable. And they are human. It has the human genome, and they seem to have no other genetic defect other than they lost the signals for stop growing. That's all they've lost, essentially. So the HEC line is a very stable human cell line that is used in many labs of the world. Many of the people who use this line don't even know or even care where it came from, because it's being removed so far away. And certainly, even say a Catholic person who is using this line is so far removed from the original abortion, certainly would not will the abortion and could still use the cell line. All right. In fact, none of the cells of the original kidney, of the embryonic kidney, none of those cells are left already, because that was 50 years ago. So just in the first passage already, they are descendants of those cells. You know, I mean, do we have any of our cells in our body from our great grandparents? Absolutely not. At most, we have 50% of our DNA from our dad and 50% of our DNA from our mom at the zygote level, at the single cell. And from then on, that percentage gets smaller and smaller and smaller with every cell division. Okay. So at most, it would be material cooperation, as long as we certainly didn't will the original abortion to have been done. Okay. And serious reason, how about developing a vaccine that could potentially save millions of lives right in the midst of a pandemic? I cannot think of a more serious reason than that. Okay, so therefore it was justified even for these 3 clinics or 3 pharmaceuticals to use the HEC line. And even further, as far as I know from the documentation, Pfizer and Moderna only used the HEC line in preliminary studies. In other words, to see if the mRNA technique would work on human cells. But that was only preliminary, not even for developing the vaccine, just to see if the mRNA technique would work on human cells. And it turns out it did. As far as I know, again, from the literature, Johnson & Johnson went further and also used the HEC line somewhere in the actual development of the vaccine. So you can say it's a further cooperation, but frankly, from the Catholic perspective, it's only material cooperation, all right? Only material cooperation, and a lot of people were confused about this. We try to get it out there with all kinds of literature and messages, even recordings that I did and others, and we pumped it out. But so there's an example of material cooperation, right, which is allowed for serious reason, as long as our will is definitely not engaged in the original evil. Okay, which, by the way, I want to mention also that there's only one way to be engaged in an evil that is past. For example, what is an evil that is past?
Original sin.
Yeah. That's the most evil that is most past. Yes, that's right. Job said original sin, in case you folks hear it. Yes. That is the most evil that is most past. Yes. And ever since, we can think of any number of evils, like, for example, a rape that has been done already, you know, or a murder that has been done already, etc., that has passed temporally and physically. All right. So how do we cooperate with something that is past? There's one way to cooperate with an evil that is past. And that is what?
You were part of it? I mean,
Well, no, we were not. Sorry,
Okay.
I needed to qualify that. Yeah, and we would not participate. We did not participate in it. We were not part of it.
okay, so.
We can still cooperate. For
do we-
example, we can cooperate in the experiments of the Nazi concentration camps
Correct.
today, even though we certainly weren't part of it.
So repeating it,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was thinking with the will, desiring it with our will, because the will is subjective. And if I desire the experiments that went on in the Nazi concentration camps, I'm participating in those experiments formally, even though I'm half a century away.
Even if you don't carry it out?
Even without carrying out, because there's an internal action of the will. That's why the will is so powerful. It's subjective, but even without, yes. In fact, I mean, our good Lord Jesus, what did he say?
Even if it's in your heart.
Even if you have desired that person disorderly, you have already committed adultery with him or her in your heart. Heart being the conscience.
Yeah.
Even if the other, I haven't touched the other person doesn't even know. But the action, the internal action of the will, of the desire is always there. Now be careful, because we're not talking about temptation. All right? Temptations will come, but the temptation comes from the outside. Even Jesus was tempted by the devil himself. All right? So we, mere mortals, cannot expect not to be tempted. But the issue here is to resist the temptation. And we resist the temptation precisely by the will. We say, get behind me, Satan. Go away. I don't want it. There's a temptation. Wow, looks real good. Bye-bye. Turn around, turn away, do something else. Okay, but the internal action of the will can engage us in good or evil, even if it's past or future. Or future. If I desire, and that's where hate and revenge and all that stuff comes in. You know, if I desire the future evil of someone else, I've already committed the act in my heart. If I really, truly desire it. So, yeah, the Christian standard is a higher standard. And that's also why Paul says, forget the law. We're above the law. The law enslaves. We're not subject to the law. The law is internal. So I don't need the civil law to tell me what's right and what's wrong. Well, I knew it when I'm growing, but once I understand and achieve maturity, then it's the internal law. And that's why Paul says in that context, it's the external law that he's talking about that enslaves, because it's still an external thing. Now, many people sadly don't ever get there, and therefore we still need the external law, okay? But the internal law, it's a much higher standard because it's based on the will. The will. All right, so that's the one way that we can cooperate with past evil, is engaging our will, which obviously we need to avoid. All right, so material cooperation, you understand the difference between formal and material. In formal, the will is engaged and desires the same evil as the principal agents. Material, we tolerate it, we don't want it, we don't desire it for a greater good or for a necessary reason. And also what's implied here is that if there was an alternative, we should not cooperate materially at all, okay? If there is an alternative, but this assumes that there is no alternative, like the mRNA technology. In other words, you know, these pharmaceuticals were under the gun to get something done fast. Okay, within material cooperation, we can break it down. It starts getting technical, all right? But just for the sake of completion, I'll give you the further breakdown, which is at 2 levels, immediate or mediate, meaning immediate or mediate is how close we are to the actual event. All right, for example, there's a difference if I am the end user. For example, let's stick with the COVID vaccine, since I covered it already and it's recent and it's relevant, we all lived it. There's also a difference if I am the pharmaceutical company or if I am an end user actually taking the vaccine, all right? So we can say that for purposes of material cooperation, let's say the pharmaceutical companies did not really desire that abortion to happen, even though they used the heck line, all right? They are a more immediate cooperation than me, the end user of the vaccine itself, of a product, okay? So they're closer. The pharmaceutical company is closer, so they have to use a more rigorous standard, if you will, to really make sure and discern that they don't want to cooperate with the evil, the original evil. Okay, and so they're doing this. So the reasons have to be very serious and so forth. And there's no other cell line, for example, available to them at that time. That's another thing that came up eventually with the Conference of Bishops. There are a number of cell lines today that are clean, as we say, ethically clean. They're not tainted. And also an encouragement, because these cell lines do take a while and a lot of money today to develop, right? So now we're encouraging pharmaceuticals and other companies to develop what we call ethical cell lines. Ethical cell lines. You know, in other words, stay away from procured abortions. Try to use adult tissue or alternatives like iPSC, which we saw, the differentiated cells, Yamanaka cells, etc. Okay, but develop ethical cell lines that can be used going forward in the industry, and it would be a good thing eventually to replace that HEC line if we ever are able to develop a line that is so good as that one, biologically speaking. All right, so you can see the pharmaceutical company is closer to the evil event than we are as end users of the vaccine itself. Okay? So that's the distinction between immediate or mediate. And it's not necessarily a physical, or it's not time or place necessarily. It's regards to the event itself. It's regards to the moral objects. How close or remote are we from the moral object, which in this case is an intrinsic evil. The further refinement of that, if we are mediate, or is this other category, proximate or remote. All right, this one is a little bit more time and place. Okay, so proximate or remote refers a little bit more to time and place. Are we actually closer in time and place to the event or not? Being that we're mediate. Okay. Again, these categories are for people who don't have a very formal training in philosophy and so forth. Can get a little fuzzy, not to worry about it. I would say at most the first break here between immediate and these is as far as we can expect to go, and even just material cooperation. In other words, as long as there's no other alternative and the reason is a serious reason, we can go with material cooperation. All right. Let me give an example of where it would not apply. But this is Alfred Chaffee doing an ethical analysis, okay? A bioethical analysis according to Catholic principles. Because I can tell you there are other Catholic theologians who disagree with me on this. Let's go back to the Dobbs decision of last year by the Supreme Court. What is the Dobbs decision? D-O-B-B-S. I'm just going to use this as my...
The abortion,
yes.
overturning of abortion at a federal level.
Right. It was Dobbs versus whoever was defending Roe v. Wade, right? And Dobbs won, so that's why it's called Dobbs decision. Okay, so some group Dobbs challenged Roe v. Wade, and so now we know the Dobbs decision then from last year of the Supreme Court, again, to be very clear, reverses Roe v. Wade, and it just says there is no constitutional right, there's no federal right to an abortion. In other words, it's not in the Constitution of the US Constitution. So it goes back to the states. It doesn't mean that Dobbs has made abortion illegal in the United States. No, by any stretch of the imagination. It goes back to pre-73. Each state decides, and we're seeing that the states are indeed deciding, right? Okay, so that's where we really have the power of the people, because we can have much more influence in Tallahassee than in DC. All right, and we should, and that's participation and civil responsibility. Now, as soon as the Dobbs decision came out, a number of big companies, I'm talking about manufacturers, I'm talking about people who sell stuff to all of us, automatically declared publicly in media that they would sponsor, that they would help any pregnant woman in their company that wanted to get an abortion, if it became illegal in that state, that they would pay for transportation and facilitate the abortion in another state. Whatever that involves, time off, sick leave, whatever, okay? And I'm talking big companies that I remember, 3 big ones, all right? You ready? This was in the news, guys, so I'm not revealing any secrets. It was Amazon, Netflix, Disney World. It's out there, all right? Immediately, I see it was bang, like a 2-step. They said that any pregnant mom who is an employee, they would facilitate whatever it takes for that woman to get an abortion if they wanted it. All right? If they have to travel out of state, put them up, or whatever it is. Now, and they pumped this out publicly. Okay? So, is that formal or material?
That's formal.
Yes, because, you know, they're willing to go back to Roe v. Wade. In other words, they're against dogs formally, and they're promoting that publicly with their employees. Very different would have been if Amazon, Netflix, and Disney World CEO could have written an internal memo of the company and said, attention, pregnant women, if you're thinking about a termination of pregnancy, please visit HR. Okay, an internal memo to the women employees of the company, visit HR, and then in the HR, you give them all the rules and regulations. But no, they pumped it out to the world because I saw it again, like I say everything on the BBC World News in my phone the following morning. Why? You know, why? Why did they do that? Why did they have to do that? And so now, watching a film from Netflix is not a life or death situation. Buying stuff from Amazon generally is not a life or death situation. It could be, maybe, if we're buying our food from Amazon or who knows what, okay? And certainly going to Disney is not a life or death situation, even though a number of kids and adults may think that. So you see, there, it's not a serious reason. It's not a serious reason. Okay, so that could jump from material into formal. Okay, so these are examples of cooperation. We need to navigate through all this. And therefore, the very first thing that we need to make this decision, essential between formal and material, what's the very first thing that we need when an issue comes to us, the possibility of engaging in a moral action? Information, knowledge. You have to check the sources. You have to get rid and navigate through fake news and real news and all that. Okay, so the news sources, which are also slanted and whatnot. So you have to get to the real issue, you know. Okay. All right. Anything else on cooperation with evil? This is also, these principles are coming out of, especially this one, and also double effect that I'll cover in a few minutes. But this one is actually part 6 of the ERDs, right? Part 6, which is a new section on that document on the 6th edition. And we also worked on that when I was more full-time with the NCBC, because now in the clinical setting, it has to do with mergers, hospital mergers. And I've talked about the Mercy Baptist merger, potential merger that was flying around in the 90s here in Miami, Mercy Hospital being the Catholic hospital, Baptist Hospital being the Baptist Hospital in Miami. And they were both standalones, and in the 90s there was talk about a merger and so forth. I talked about that. But so at the level of institutions, right, these institutions merging for some financial gain on both parts and so forth, now with systems. So these healthcare systems, it used to be not too long ago, we're talking about 30, 40 years ago, many hospitals were standalones, right? But now they have become systems. In fact, HCA, which is the one that owns, now bought Mercy, it's been about 12, maybe 12, 15 years now, bought Mercy Hospital. HCA, Hospital Corporation of America, is possibly the largest system in the US, and it has about 170 or 180 hospitals. Down in the Southwest, they also bought Kendall Regional, for example. I used to be nearby when I was at St. Kevin's Parish, and so on and so forth. Anyway, systems, right? When a Catholic hospital is seeking to merge or buy a non-Catholic hospital, what can they agree to? What can they carve out and not agree to, and so forth? So cooperation and the limits of cooperation. I'm saying this because this principle also applies at the institutional level. And generally, at the institutional level, there's a higher standard at the institutional level. And why is the higher standard at the institutional level? Because of scandal. Okay, and in fact, I mentioned that merger fell through, to my knowledge, the merger between Mercy Catholic Hospital and Baptist Protestant Hospital, essentially, because Baptist at that time, to this day, they have an in vitro clinic that is very profitable. They want to let it go. They did a few abortions. I'm talking about Baptist back then. They did a few abortions which they were calling clinically indicated. It's a little fuzzy. It's a borderline. There are some instances like PROM, what is known as PROM, which is premature rupture of membranes for the bomb. These are all acronyms. Premature rupture of membranes. What's the main membrane? the embryonic sac that is maintaining the fetus within the liquid environment, right? The amnion and the amniotic sac. And if that ruptures, essentially the fluid that is maintaining the fetus alive, floating inside the mother's womb, will run out and desiccate and collapse. And that's a critical stage, not only for the embryo and fetus, but also for the mother. So it's kind of iffy, but we maintain basically that there is no condition of pregnancy that significantly risks the life of the mother, of the pregnant mom, to the point of justifying a procured abortion. Because by that stage of development, they can always do a C-section and have a preemie baby, put them in the NICU and ICU. NICU are the neonatal intensive care units. The first thing you learn about the NICU is that everything is tiny because they're talking about, I think, 21, 22 weeks. 22 viability right now is about 22 weeks of gestation. Yeah. The picture says 1,000 words. Here's one. There's an identifier. Okay. These NICUs, these are, of course, he or she is a fetus already, all right? But they're tiny. So, I mean, they basically fit in the palm of a big hand. And they're being saved. 22 weeks. I think 21 is the record. It's less than half the time of pregnancy, about 4.5 months. All right, so anyway, scandal is for institutions more than for individuals. Because if I go get an abortion, well, I'll scandalize the people around me. But if a Catholic hospital is doing abortions, they'll scandalize the whole population. Okay, and so the institution has a higher standard, higher ethical standard when it comes to some of these. And therefore, you will see in the ERDs on section 4, part 4, which is beginning of life issues, where it says that even material cooperation with an abortion is not allowed in a Catholic hospital. Material, because of the perception. We live in two worlds simultaneously. We live in the world of reality and the perception of reality. And many times the perception of reality doesn't match the reality, but it's what people go for. All right? And therefore, to avoid any semblance of cooperating with abortion, material cooperation in abortion is not allowed in a Catholic hospital. Okay? And so you see, because of the perception. So we have to be very aware of scandal. And the more public we are, the more people know us, the more aware we have to be of this. Okay? Anything else on cooperation? Again, think about it a little bit. Read part 6 of the ERDs, all right? So 3 or 4 pages, not even that. Finally, double effect. This principle of double effect is used quite a bit in healthcare, quite a bit. And it's kind of a segue on cooperation and the limits of cooperation. You'll see how. So there have to be these 4/5 conditions in order for the principle of double effect to apply, all right? First, the act itself must be morally good or neutral. You see, this is the moral object. This is the moral object. The act itself, all right, must be either good or neutral, morally, ethically speaking. Then the evil effect must not flow directly, not directly willed, not desired. So again, this precludes formal cooperation. So far, it could be material cooperation, which is tolerated. So the evil effect itself must not be directly willed or desired, okay? May be tolerated, which is different. Now, the good effect must not flow directly from the evil effect. The good effect must not flow directly from the evil effect. I'll give you an example that hopefully will crystallize it for you. Okay? In other words, if it's double effect, the two effects, the good and the evil effect, arise simultaneously from the one intervention and not one following the other. So double effect means that both arise simultaneously and not one from the other, the evil from the good or the good from the evil, right? Fourth, there has to be proportionality. The way a professor put it to me once, you don't go after a fly with a sledgehammer. You use a fly swatter, okay? And so there has to be proportionality. If there's a lesser way for me to stop the unjust aggressor, if I could restrain the unjust aggressor and throw a net over him instead of killing him, I should do that, okay? So proportionality. And last resort. This last resort is implied. I should put it in down here also. Okay, so this. Because it's implied that because is we're appealing to the principle of double effect, then it is the last. There's no other alternative that is more healthy. Okay. So let's look at each one. All right. Morally good. I talked about this is the object, the moral object itself. Here is the will, the subject, right? The desire, what is the will? Then they must occur simultaneously, the two effects, not one follow from the other. talked about proportionality, last resort. Let me give you an example, which is very challenging, but very real. And the classical example for this is an ectopic pregnancy. We covered ectopic pregnancy, right? Even though briefly. So the normal pregnancy belongs in the uterus because that's the organ, the smooth muscle that can stretch and contain a fetus full term, without bursting. Any other place in the reproductive system or outside of the reproductive system is a critical danger for the mother, especially when the placenta is established and that continues to grow and grow. So imagine the fallopian tubes, which are very small, thin tubes. They're not designed to sustain a pregnancy. And so thanks be to God that most ectopic pregnancies resolve spontaneously. In other words, the inner lining of the tube manages to dislodge that embryo before the placenta is established. And that's great. It's at least half of them, if not more, of the ectopic pregnancies resolve spontaneously. In other words, they don't continue. And that little embryo is lost, is discarded. It's a spontaneous abortion, it's like a spontaneous abortion. But if they persist, if the embryo does not dislodge and persist, there are two, remember, salpingectomy or salpingostomy. The one is excising the tube, and the other one is opening up a slit and scraping out the embryo. So it gets very tricky, and we have to stick with the rigor of thinking rationally, because obviously for both salpingectomy and salpingostomy, the embryo will die. But in the one, the embryo is being killed. In the other, the embryo is being allowed to die. Okay? So let's look at them for a moment. There it is, salpingectomy. Okay. Image. Okay, where it has okay, this is the easiest diagram. Salpingectomy, all right, is the tube is being ejected wherever the little embryo lodged. So salpingectomy, you can think of rejecting the tube. Salpingostomy is going in and scraping out the tube. There's the incision. And then it's sewed back. There. In fact, nowadays, if the embryo is small enough, they would actually inject methotrexate. And methotrexate is a chemical that goes after rapidly dividing cells. What are the most rapidly dividing cells in the embryo? The most is, now remember, this is beyond blastocysts, right? Because they're implanted already. This is the gastrula. It's actually the placenta. It's the most rapidly dividing cells. Every cell is dividing very rapidly, but especially the placenta is trying to establish that connector. I mean, it's minute by minute, hour by hour that placenta is being formed fast because it needs nutrition and it has to get rid of toxins, all right? And therefore, the placenta is basically the most rapidly dividing tissue there. So this methotrexate goes after those rapidly dividing cells, essentially kills the placenta. Now, the placenta, is the placenta a vital organ? Can the embryo fetus survive without the placenta? Natural. No. Therefore, the placenta is a vital organ. But it's a vital organ that is discarded at birth. It's the only vital organ that is temporary. We don't discard a liver or a brain or a lung or a heart when we're born or any time after that until we hit the grave. But the placenta is a vital organ that only serves the pregnancy stage, the first 9 months, and then it's discarded. But it serves this function. Okay, so again, think functionally. While it's going on, while it's needed, it's a vital organ. So if we target that organ, is equivalent to an injection to the heart, because we're killing a vital organ on purpose. And so it's a killing. What I'm trying to say is that salpingostomy is the killing of the embryo, whereas salpingectomy is excising the tube, is allowing the embryo to die inside. But the salpingectomy is, well, both are addressing a pathology. And the pathology is that the embryo is in the wrong place. By exercising, by the embryo implanting into the fallopian tube, that embryo has made the fallopian tube pathological, has made the fallopian tube non-functional and life-threatening to the mother because that pregnancy is going to continue to grow. When that tube bursts, it will cause a massive hemorrhage. It's very vascularized, it's full of capillaries, all right? So it's life-threatening to the mother if the ectopic pregnancy doesn't resolve by itself. There has to be an intervention. So what the salpingectomy does, it addresses the pathology of the tube and it's excising a pathological tube, right? It's really not, and think about it this way, it's not the embryo that is going to kill the mother directly. It is the pathological tube. It is the bursting of the tube that will kill the mother. And so we excise the source of the pathology, which is the tube itself. It happens that the embryo is inside. So it's tolerated. We know it's going to happen, but we don't will to kill that embryo. If we could, we would rescue that embryo and implant him or her back into the womb. The problem with that, so why don't we do that? In fact, one of our Catholic theologians actually questioned that. Well, we're doing a salpingectomy. Are we not also obliged to reimplant that embryo or to attempt reimplantation? We can say in principle, yes, but in practice, what does that imply? How do we get this embryo out of here to begin with? So tiny, so delicate, so risky. And that's a human intervention. And so if we risk the life of this embryo by attempting to implant him or her, we may actually end up killing the embryo. And so what we're doing here is, tragically, we're allowing the embryo to die, but we're not intervening on the embryo for the risk of killing the embryo, because this embryo is just too young. We don't have the technology that is so sophisticated as to be able to excise an embryo from here without harm and seek to implant him or her back in here. Plus, the mother has just had surgery, so this reproductive system is all inflamed. It's not a candidate for sustaining a pregnancy, okay? And so, where theoretically we could feel obliged to try to reimplant this embryo, we have to let them go. Because in practice, it just cannot be done without excessive risk to the embryo himself and to the mother herself. So we are allowing the embryo to die. It is sad, but we're not intervening directly on the embryo. Crucial, critical, and that's why we may do salpingectomies, but not salpingostomies, because here we're actually going after the embryo. Now, what does this do? Why salpingostomy clinically, medically? What's the advantage clinically of salpingostomy? We're removing the embryo and therefore, resuturing the fallopian tube and give it a little bit of time forward. This tube, everything else being equal, will heal. And we have saved the reproductive capacity of the mother. Now, keep in mind that in sapingectomy, it's not that we excise both tubes, because if the other tube is healthy, it's healthy. So the mom with a sapingectomy has lost 50% of her fertility on one side, but in principle, if the other side is still functional, it's functional, and she can still get pregnant on this side. All right, so we have reduced, let's say, her chances of future pregnancy by 50%, but not 100%. So that's the first point. But here is sapingostomy. In theory, by just scraping out the embryo, this tube may heal, and we have preserved 100% of the mom's future fertility. I say in principle, theoretically, because there's also going to be a scar here. And it could be we have to ask the question, why did the embryo get lodged in here to begin with? Maybe there was scar tissue, which is a very common thing for women. If they have scar tissue within the reproductive tract, that little tiny blastocyst may get stuck there. So now with a little bit of scarring from the surgery, it could be that unwittingly we have created another roadblock for the embryo. And future embryos will get stuck there too, because of the sapingostomy scarring, all right? It's a possibility. And so we have to be careful that in the sapingostomy, we're not exacerbating the problem further. But anyway, in principle, at least, the one that is, say, least invasive, or not least invasive, but the one that seeks to preserve the fertility, the future fertility of the woman more best, is sapingostomy and not sapingectomy. And therefore, clinically indicated, clinicians are going to follow sapingostomy to the point, and I don't know this for a fact, but to the point that some insurance companies may cover sapingostomy and not sapingectomy, because sapingostomy for the health of the mother only is more clinically indicated, right? And so it could be that some insurance companies or even some clinical protocols, they discard sapingectomy because it's not as advantageous to the mother strictly as sapingostomy. And yet, the one is allowing to die the human embryo, human life, innocent human life. The other one is killing the human life, innocent. So very challenging. And here's where, in general, bioethicists and clinicians go head to head. Right? But it's an example of the principle of double effect that is used. And you can find other applications. Like I say, it's used quite a bit in healthcare today, this double effect. Okay. But all these 5 conditions need to apply. And of course, the last one should be the first one. You know, it's the last resort. There's no other possible alternative with the art of medicine here and now. Okay, folks, that's it. Here are some sources also at the end. And questions, comments?
Thank you, Dr. Chofi.
All right, you're welcome. Now, next class, as I mentioned, will be our last one, all right? And we'll look at this case of nutrition and hydration in the case of a patient in vegetative state, if and when to disconnect, you know, under what conditions. And so we'll be applying these principles, and hopefully I'll introduce the other one of subsidiarity. All right. Thanks again, then, and have a great week. We'll meet up again for the last time this course next Saturday. Don't forget to evaluate the course. All right. Send me your hours, etc., etc., etc.
Thank you, Father. Have a good
Okay,
week.
you're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Dr. Chofi.
Okay, my pleasure. Bye.